Hey everyone, Curse Deck Builder here, making our way to 10,000 decks assisted. And today we're going to be looking at two more decks from Kybor, who is once again supporting our channel. Thank you so much, Kybor. It means a lot, and I'm excited to see the two decks today. Our first one is going to be Brimaz, Blight of Oreskos. This is a Phyrexian tribal deck, and a pretty interesting one at that. Looking at the note from Kybor, it says, haven't had a chance to play this deck yet, so I'm not sure what needs to be improved. While I imagine an infect strategy would be fairly powerful with this commander, it's not something I'm personally interested in pursuing, as I mostly want to keep it as Phyrexian tribal tech. I was mostly thinking, sorry, I've noticed I have a new way of reading people's notes and it makes it a bit harder. I was mostly thinking if there were any good ways to get +1/+1 counters on all my creatures so that proliferating is more impactful, or other things to proliferate tokens onto. If there are any Phyrexian you would recommend including these colors. Also, if there's any good way to cheat flip the incubator tokens, either by generating lots of mana to flip them, or by having a way to flip them for free, or using them to do something else, or as another resource for something. Any other ideas or suggestions are always appreciated. Thank you, Kybor. Very much appreciate it. And I think everyone should go and take a look at this deck that you can find in the video description below. It is a very, very fun looking deck. I was very suspicious of Brimaz when I first saw the new version of him. I didn't quite understand how we were supposed to build around him. And I think this is a very good version of that. I think it really does solve a lot of the problems that I think the deck has and goes in a direction that I think is both fun and functional. Though I have some few notes to add to it, I'm sure if anyone else takes a look and you think of something I haven't, I'd love for you to leave a comment below, and so we can all make the deck as strong as possible. So, who is Brimaz, Blight of Oreskos, and why are we using them as our Phyrexian tribal commander? Well, he's a 4-mana white-black Phyrexian cat, 3/4. And he says whenever you cast a Phyrexian creature or artifact creature spell, incubate X, where X is that spell's mana value. As a reminder, incubate creates an incubation token, which I think we should be able to find in the token section here. Let's see, yes, an incubator token, which has +1/+1 counters equal to the mana value. And then for 2 mana, we can flip it onto the other side where it's a creature. Much like the zombies we got from the last time we visited Innistrad. I'm trying to remember what they had, but they had decay, which means the zombies died out after they attacked. This is similar, where they have created a way to produce tokens that are not as strong as just regular 2/2s or 3/3s. But in exchange for that, you can produce them more easily and get more out of them. So there's a bit of a back and forth here. I agree with Kybor's assessment that one of the best things we can do is use the tokens as artifacts as opposed to just turning them into creatures, because I think that's pretty good. But I do really also enjoy the deck's ability to kind of just play fairly and leave all the incubators off to the side, and then whenever we have extra mana or we have the means to flip them, that we just start flipping them. And I think that's a pretty good strategy there. Now, the main kind of thing we're going to be considering is how far we go into Phyrexian Tribal, because that's going to kind of inform how Brimaz plays. I haven't even finished reading Brimaz. Let's get back to that. At the beginning of each end step, if a Phyrexian died under your control this turn, proliferate. Now this is really, really good because this is each end step and not just your own. And so we're gonna think of a few things we can do to ensure that happens every turn, which I'm going to make, oops, a note of that now. So just do that. So we're gonna take a look at what options we have to flip, what options we have to change. But first, let's do what we always do and take a look at the curve. The curve is pretty solid. As I often point out, our 4-drops are kind of high. We've got 12 4-drops, including Brimaz. So we might take a bit of a look at this to kind of see which ones we should be playing and which ones maybe we should be more critical of. Because having Brimaz early is really important for the deck. Brimaz is already a pretty good creature, but once you have him out, every single Phyrexian you cast starts the chain going. Every Phyrexian that dies starts proliferating. We we want this out quickly, so every other 4-drop here contends with our cat. So before going through a general look, let's take a look at the 4-drops, see what we can find. So we have the newest Elish Norn, who is veritably a beast at 3/5 for 4 mana, a ton of abilities, flips into something really, really strong with a bunch of incubation synergy, you know, also destroys all permanents outside of Phyrexians and artifacts and lands, mind you. Like this is so good, we can't really in the right mind get rid of this. After this, we have Filigree Vector, which also is incredibly on theme. I think it actually comes with this deck. I believe so. Yes. And I think, like, it is honestly, in my mind, the strongest card out of this precon. And I think it should absolutely be used in every deck that cares about +1/+1 counters and has artifacts to sacrifice. And so I am just funny because I'm thinking out loud that there's a oh, it's because the other deck, yeah. Because we've been looking at some +1/+1 counter decks that didn't have this in there, but didn't really have artifacts to sacrifice. Whereas here we have tons of artifacts to sacrifice, and therefore we are particularly happy. So absolutely got to keep the Filigree Vector. Might Overseer is a card I keep having trouble with. I see this card keep coming up, and I'm not quite sure why. It has a lot of text, but a lot of the text is kind of inconsequential, let's say. So let's look at it this way. What at the baseline Might Overseer is a 4/2 first strike for 4, which is not particularly good. Like, you don't want to play that kind of body in Commander because it doesn't do much. Now, as long as it's your turn, creature tokens have +1/+0 and have first strike. Now, the thing I'm thinking about is obviously this is being used with our our Phyrexian, not the mites, but the incubators and the Phyrexian tokens that we're getting out of our incubation, sorry. And I think that makes it a little better than using it with mites, because 2/1 first strike mites are awful. But if we can give all of our Phyrexians, like especially I don't know what I'm gonna call them golems just to kind of, or I'm just gonna say incubators. It's just because they're Phyrexians and that's the same type of our creatures. I'm confusing myself. But all of our incubators, if all of a sudden they have +1/+0, but mainly first strike, that's pretty good. But how good is it, right? I think it kind of exists. It's kind of tricky because once again, this is the same mana cost as our commander. It's 4 mana, so it's not like we can play the Might Overseer and have mana to like flip a bunch of incubators. It's a little tricky. And to this degree, I wonder how much happier would you be with something a little simpler like, let's see, our white enchantment that gives tokens. Where are you? Intangible virtue style effects. Now, don't get me wrong, First Strike is much, much more powerful than Vigilance. However, this is just going to give you a +1/+1 that exists on everyone's turns, and you have Vigilance, which allows your deck to be a lot more defensive. And this, once again, will work on all of your tokens. So the thing about the fact that it says as long as it's on your turn, the basis of that is that this is meant to be used with mites, right? And mites obviously don't mind that they don't get the buff when it's not your turn because they can't block anyways. So you're pretty happy having that ability just on your turn. But when we have our incubators, that's not as true. We want to have them on defense. We want to leave them back, and then losing first strike is particularly rough. Even losing the +1 is pretty rough as well. So already intangible virtue just feels a bit stronger and more consistent for if you want this kind of effect, which I'm not sure if you do, but just a comparison here. And finally, for 3 mana to create one, because you're probably paying the 2 life to create one Phyrexian Might. I mean, you'd rather just flip a incubator, right? Like you don't want to pay 3 mana for a 1/1 here. So all in all, I'm not particularly impressed with this guy. I would definitely cut him out. Mondrak, fantastic. Once again, I like the ones that are easy that we can just say yes. It is so good that it is absolutely worth doing. Rhea Ivor is a really, really interesting commander or creature or legendary creature. The battle cry is very, very relevant. And what you can do is turn one creature's damage into mites. Now, the success of this is going to vary. I think you can get a little political and ask the right player to hey, if you let this through, it won't do any damage to you, or, I'll do this favor for you. And you can produce a pretty large amount of mites by doing so. But, and this is the big but, Rhea Ivor is also at 4 mana, and she's also kind of clunky. This is a 4 mana card that you have to use. So thankfully, you can use it on the turn you play her by picking a creature. But if she's your only creature or your only substantial creature, let's say you've started off the game and pretty much, let's say you don't have your commander and you just have some of your 1/1s and 2/2s or anything like that, like Mirror Convert, and we go in for that attack and we convert that Mirror Convert's power into 2 mites. Then your opponent goes to your opponent's turn and they wipe at the board. Well, you've kind of just wasted 4 mana. Or even if they just remove Rhea from like they just destroy her during that turn cycle, you've spent 4 mana to make like 2 mites and basically ignore 2 damage that you could have done. That's just I think a little too weak for the deck. And though I can see it in other decks, when we add in the fact that Brimaz is also 4 mana, it's really getting to the point that I think it's just too close, and I would probably want Rhea to be cut out. Terror of Tawashi is really cool, but I don't really think here it's really good. So basically, every time it attacks, you get to pay 4 mana to reanimate a creature. That's not like cheaper, right? That's basically the amount of mana for a reanimation spell outside of like the really powerful ones. And you have to wait to attack with this creature. In the meantime, it's just a 4/3 death touch. In addition, it says you have to return it from your battlefield, sorry, your graveyard, which is limiting because you don't really have, though we have sacrifice, we don't really have a way to kind of entomb or put our really big, you know, like Elish Norn, Grand Cenobite, or Shieldred, the Whispering One. We don't have ways to put that in our graveyard to take advantage of a cheaper reanimation cost and casting it ourselves. And even then, the ability that it turns those creatures into Phyrexians doesn't really matter because almost all of our creatures, are Phyrexians to begin with. So all of that together, I think this is just a little too weak. It's just at the wrong mana cost. It takes too long to do anything. And there's going to be times you're going to attack with this that you don't even have creatures in your graveyard, so you're not going to be particularly excited to be using this card. Finally, I think it's worth also mentioning that this deck is mana hungry, and putting more cards that are mana hungry is probably not the direction we want to go into, because we're really going to be draining out our mana. Yogg is in here most obviously as flavor primarily, but also it works particularly well. I don't think he's a Phyrexian, but that might have happened after the case. Yeah, he's still just a human cleric. He's not a Phyrexian here. So Weirdly enough, he is our only card that doesn't satisfy either of our requirements of being an artifact creature or a Phyrexian. I'm pretty sure. I've taken a few looks, but I could be wrong. And I think that's kind of funny because it's also Yawgmoth, but I think with his ability to sacrifice creatures at instant speed and everything else he generally does with the proliferate, he fits here pretty well, and I would be amiss to take him out in a Phyrexian themed deck. So absolutely keep it. Chroma's Will is a win condition. I think that's fine. Deadly Rollick, you're paying 0. I think that's fine. Anointed Procession is kind of also ideal here because it works with our synergy. And Smothering Tide is a really, really good card. So you might have noticed that I think I suggested to take out maybe 2, 3 of these 12 cards. I wish I could suggest more, but the 4-drop slot of this deck is just really, really strong. So what do we do to kind of alleviate this? Well, you're already doing mostly what I'm doing, where we're playing Plague Mirror, Mirror Convert, Gold Mirror, and there's Leaden Mirror, right? We're playing Orzhov Signet, Talisman of Hierarchy, Everflowing Chalice, which is technically a 2-drop mana artifact. But I think also if you wanted Arcane Signet can fit into here. Anything that's going to get us to 4 mana sooner is probably a card that's worth running because we just have a lot of really good cards in the 4-drop section. And none of these artifacts are going to be wasted because in the end, we can use them to crack our eggs and our incubator tokens in order to get an army going. So I do really like that. They're also sacrifice targets for other sacrifice cards. So I think it's really worth going a bit further on them, maybe 2 or 3 more, nothing too crazy, just so that we can ensure that we are getting the mana for all of these 4-drops that we have. Then I'm going to take a second to point out a few cards that I think kind of stand out to me. Phyrexian Walker and Crawling Chorus, and frankly, to a point, yeah, also Bilious Skullwelder. So, okay, and honestly, Fume Spitter as well. Sorry, there's a few here. These are our very small Phyrexians. And don't get me wrong, I like them, and I like what they represent here. They represent more 1-drops in a deck that wants to go wide, a deck that can grow. I just don't think they naturally belong here because there's 2 reasons for it. One, Phyrexian Walker, though cool, does create a 0/0 incubator token, so that particular token can never be used and it can never be transformed. That's not the worst thing. We can sacrifice it for other things, but it's something worth considering. And in the same way, but almost worse, the 1-drop Phyrexians all of them represent just a 1/1 incubator, which you can flip. So at certain points, you're going to be incentivized to flip, but it's just a 1/1 creature that you've effectively paid 2 mana for, which is a pretty bad deal. Now with Proliferate, it's not that bad. Most likely it's not going to be a 1/1 creature, but there's an adage that I really like in Magic, which is don't play bad cards to make good cards better. And Brimaz in your deck is already a very good card. And Bilious Skull Dweller, I see. Bilious Skull Dweller is an awful card. It's just not very good, right? A Death Touch blocker seems pretty good, but Toxic means you want to be aggressive with it. And yeah, having this out turn 1 means you can probably infect your opponents, and every proliferate is a little more dangerous for them. But I don't think oftentimes that's going to be the thing that changes the game. Remember when you're proliferating as your main method of like poisoning someone? Your deck only has a few consistent ways. Like, yes, with Brimaz, there's situations where you can go through a turn cycle and sacrifice 4 Phyrexians over that turn cycle and get 4 proliferates at each end step. That's really cool, but that's rather unlikely because we don't have that many sacrifice outlets. You don't have an infinite board at that point in the game. It's going to be really tough to proliferate to 10, especially with your opponents who are incentivized to keep destroying Brimaz or any other form of proliferate support that you have. This deck is already kind of very much boosted by its commander. You don't want to give people more reason to have those commanders. Also, these cards are just going to be awful to draw into later in the game, with Fume Spitter being a bit of an exception because I do really like the Proliferate synergy here, as it itself, when sacrificed, will put a -1/-1 counter on something, and through that trigger Brimaz to do the proliferation. So I would keep Fume Spitter, but the other ones I think are, probably good to go. Obviously, Esper Sentinel is very, very good here, and Skrelv is also very, very good. There might be a universe where you cast Progenitor Exarch for 1. I think that's fine. I think this can be a reasonable 1-drop. But I think most likely you'd be a lot happier casting it for 3 to at least get that first incubate. However, if you do draw a if you do cast it for 1, it does open up the fact that you're going to be able to get a free transform every turn, and I think that's definitely worth casting it early. And a 1/2 is really not bad. This is a particularly pushed card, I would say, even though it really doesn't feel like it, because a 1/2 for 1 with a relevant ability is pretty good on the first turn, and the fact that it scales makes it even better. Looking down, we have Blight Titan Blight Titan kind of stands out at me as being probably the weakest higher mana cost card you have. He just doesn't do enough. The fact that, okay, so you mill yourself 2 and then you incubate X, where X is the number of creatures in your graveyard. You have very little control over that, and though a third of your deck is creatures, that might not still be enough to like reliably be milling into your deck to get substantial, substantial incubations out of its triggers. Whereas the fact that he's a 6-drop makes you an incubate 6 with Brimaz, which I think is the best deal you're getting out of it, is the free incubate 6 when you cast this card. But you get that when you cast Wormcoil Engine, which is just vastly better card, right? So Blight Titan feels really clumsy. It feels like, a 6/6 Death Touch isn't particularly good. I guess the way I would put it is I don't like Grave Titan. And this card is definitely worse than Grave Titan, because Grave Titan makes 2/2/2s every one of its triggers, and otherwise has the same stats. And if I don't like Grave Titan, I won't really advocate for Blight Titan. So I think you like, if you just compare it to all of your other 6-drops here, or like higher, like Wormcoil Engine, Elish Norn, Shieldred, it's very clear that Blight Titan is the weakest of the pack, and I think should be cut for that reason. Looking at sorceries, White Sun's Twilight feels a little weak, and I would suggest maybe if this card was like an instant, I would feel a lot better, but I don't really like its modularness. I know it's interesting because you can just create a bunch of mites which can fuel your sacrifice engine, but I do feel that like that's a lot of mana. Once again, this deck is very mana hungry, and if you're using this with the possibility it could be a board clear, I would just play a board clear. I would just play Wrath of God or Damnation in this slot, or Toxic Deluge. As I mentioned, a lot has just been reprinted. Each of those are probably just better cards. And to be fair, oops, Toxic Deluge, I think, just had a Phyrexian theme printing, which I really liked. Yes, this one. So, Commander Collection Black, $11. I think if you want to stay on theme, I think that would be a really, really good choice. Sunfall is fine here. It's on theme, so I do get why it's there. The Exile is just really, really nice. There will be times this hurts you as well pretty badly, but you'll have to use it anyways, and I think that's fine. So use it, pretty good. Coming down here, Excise the Imperfect, I'm really suspicious of. You're playing Generous Gift, which I would see this as Generous Gift number 2 with the Exile, trigger. I think it's fine. It's a card I'm rather suspicious of. I think people were really, really excited for it, but I think it's just the second Generous Gift. Like, if you were in green, I would tell you to play Beast Within before it. But, I mean, it's on theme. It's funny to give your opponents Phyrexians. I think this is fine. Stinging Study is really, really close here. I think 4 mana commanders is kind of the point that I start even thinking about Stinging Study. But Stinging Study is the kind of card that benefits when you can hold up a bunch of mana, right? There's not a lot of cards in this deck that operate at instant speed. And though you can say that you're holding up your mana in order to flip your creatures, a lot of the times you don't want to. This is something I alluded to earlier in this video where I think this deck has a bit of how do I put this? It has a bit of a tension between whether or not it wants to be full on Phyrexian creatures or it wants to hold up mana to deal with its incubations and make the most of it. I prefer this version where we go more all in on the Phyrexian creatures because it feels more proactive. And so, since we're not doing that, having a 5 mana card you have to hold up mana for instead of flipping incubation tokens or casting something else seems a little tricky to me. I think you'd be happier playing in your sorcery thing, something like Read the Bone, something just lower in mana to give you a little bit of draw. I know it won't be a draw 4, but I just think this card doesn't really fit the style of this deck as much as we'd like it to. So I'm a little harsh on this one. Coming down here, I think I'm pretty much happy. I love Sigarda's summons here. I think this is such a good deck to play it. I I had to read this card a bunch of times because I actually had this moment of like, well, you don't have that many creatures with +1/+1 counters until I realized every incubator does. I'm so used to the incubators being just the power they are in my mind that it actually took me a second to recognize how strong this is with the incubators because turning 0/0s into 4/4s is just immensely powerful that I have no problem with this being 6 mana. I think this is really, really good. I think it is a bit awkward as it is a 6 mana card that doesn't play to the board immediately, but you if you have the setup for it, it's going to be a card that absolutely knocks the game out of the park. I will say also something that's worth knowing is that when we pair this with Intangible Virtue, I really think it gives it the last creature ability that we really, really want, where for our tokens, not for all of our creatures, unfortunately. Giving all of our creatures flying is really good, but also giving them vigilance, turning them into basically Sarah Angels, is the final kind of thing that works really well with this, because then every single one of your attacks just goes in every direction, because now you're attacking with every single creature you can because they have flying, and giving them vigilance allows you to keep all of them back for defense, which I think is really, really strong. So something just to consider. I think I skipped these two here. Invasion of New Capenna is perfect here. Vraska the Betrayal Sting is okay. I'm always a little suspicious of this card. I know its ability to proliferate is seen as a big boon, but I often do think that 5 mana is just a little too much for this ability, especially since she'll only come in with 4 counters as opposed to 6. Not that it particularly matters, because most likely you're just going to be using her 0 anyways. All right, all that said, let's take a look at a few suggestions I have and answer some of your questions. Oof, we're already 30 minutes in. I will try to go fast on this. Something I noticed in your sideboard was Braid's Arisen Nightmare. Now, I recognize to a point that most likely you've tried to purposely not put any creatures that aren't Phyrexians or artifacts outside of Yawgmoth for obvious reasons. And I think we should consider a few as long as what they do is strong enough or worthwhile. Braids answers a lot of the problems that the incubators have. All of a sudden, your incubators are just going to be sacrificed end of turn and hopefully draw you cards or force sacrifices on other people's boards. I think this is pretty strong. I think I would definitely play Braids for this effect because she just represents so much card advantage and so much board advantage by sacrificing the artifacts turn after turn. Sorry. Now it gets a little tricky when those artifacts are flipped because they become creature artifacts, and all of a sudden your opponents have 2 choices to sacrifice instead of one, which is why I kind of like to sacrifice them when they're eggs because you're going to get a lot more out of it because it's much more likely for people to have extra superfluous creatures than to have extra superfluous tokens. That being said, there might be situations where you want to just pick one of your creatures instead. That's perfectly fine. And don't forget, we can sacrifice lands too, which sometimes does come up. So I think Braids should absolutely be in this deck. I think it is a very, very strong card here. I think another card when it comes to drawing and comes to Phyrexian ideas is Pact of the Serpent. This is actually I did bury the lead a bit. This is actually the one I would suggest over Stinging Contract, Stinging Study. Sorry, it is a sorcery speed spell, but you just name Phyrexian and you're drawing upwards of 7 or 8 cards. I think this this deck is very good at making like a wide board of Phyrexians very quickly. And in fact, after a board clear, you can spend a turn doing nothing, let the turn cycle go around, animate all of your incubators. So you turn and let's just say you get 4 Phyrexians, you untap, you probably have the mana to either flip another Phyrexian or cast a Phyrexian from your hand, and then still cast Pact of the Serpent. There you go. Very quickly, you are drawing 5 cards for 5 life and 3 mana, which I think is very, very strong and very much worth it. So this is a card I would definitely suggest you're in a black tribal deck. It is very, very good, and I think, especially in a deck like this, it is very, very good. On that note of card draw, I think Corrupted Conviction is a little close for our sack outlet. I think you really do want repeated sack outlets as opposed to a one-time thing, whereas at least Deadly Dispute can sacrifice artifacts. Corrupted Conviction feels really, really narrow. And with that in mind, another non-Phyrexian creature I think could be worth considering is Carrion Feeder or Visceraseer. Sorry, Visceraseer. I'll get it one day. Visceraseer or Carrion Feeder, I often put into Aristocrats decks because they represent a sack outlet for 1 mana. Now, you already have quite a few, so I wouldn't suggest playing both, but I think just like Carrion Feeder could be fine to begin with, and I don't think you'd be too unhappy about that. I think another creature that is not a Phyrexian that's worth considering when we talk about +1/+1 counters is Luminarch Aspirant. Luminarch Aspirant is really, really good at putting that first +1/+1 counter on a creature. In fact, if it's the first creature you play in a game, it is amazing at, just putting that first counter on itself. And then after which, every creature you play, as long as you play it in your first main phase, kind of comes in with a +1/+1 counter. As you do that, and as your proliferations work out, I think it's going to be it's going to show its strength very, very quickly. Granted, once again, not a Phyrexian, which is worth considering, but overall, I think a rather good card. Considering that its price is so cheap at 27 cents US, so I would say probably under $1 or $1, depending on where you buy from, I think it's definitely an inclusion that's worth having. And a card that, if you are running decks that play white and have +1/+1 counters, this is a card that I would collect across the board for sure. Then when we go into Proliferate, there's 2 cards that, let me see, that I've been thinking of, and one more that I'm going to try to note to my side. Let's see, Phyrexian and Transform. All right, so the first one I want to say is let's look at Proliferate, Flying, and I believe it's Spirit. If we're looking for another way to proliferate that works mostly on theme in this deck, Grateful Apparition is pretty decent at it. Now, it's not ideal. This tends to work better in +1/+1 counter decks, but I do like that it's low mana. I do like you can trigger it every turn most of the time. And I do like that once it starts, like, it does really grow a lot of creatures as your plan continues. It is too bad that it is not a Phyrexian. That is what it is. You already have a lot of really good proliferate strategies or cards. So we're at the point that whichever ones we pick, we are kind of taking the worst ones or the least, uh, let's say the ones that aren't the easiest to kind of work. Another one that's worth considering is commander proliferate are 5 mana Norn's Choirmaster, which is very, very much on theme, where Norn's Choirmaster says, whenever a commander you control enters the battlefield or attacks, proliferate. It is a 5/4 first strike angel, which is a very, very good body. And if you curve into this right after Brimaz, not only do you make a 5/5 incubator token, you also immediately, when you attack with Brimaz, you trigger the proliferate. I think that's really strong. I'm a little surprised you aren't already playing it, to be honest. It does feel like the exact kind of card. It might have even been. It's not actually in that. It's in the commander before, which feels weird, but I'm not going to question it too much. This is the kind of card that's just really, really strong in a deck like this. Just really does a lot. And I mean, that full art is really good. I think it's interesting that the full art is cheaper because I think the full art is the one you got in the packs, and the non-full art was in the commander box, which is just more expensive. I think that's kind of funny. But I think this could be a card to include as a proliferate trigger while being on theme for Phyrexian Angel. After that, we were looking at other ways to use or to flip our tokens. Attentive Sky Warden is an interesting one. Now, like Gifted Apparition, it's not a good creature. It is a creature you're using for its attack trigger and nothing else really, or damage trigger for Phyrexian Attentive Sky Warden. So this says every time we hit a player, we flip a incubator. What this means is every time, so this is a 3 mana card that after 2 attacks pays for its mana cost. Every subsequent attack after the fact pays for 2 extra mana. I think that's fine. Uh, I think that's just maybe even borderline good. I don't really know for sure. I think I'd have like the fact that if you play this after Brimaz, that it comes with its own incubator token, I think it's really, really good. If you can slap a pair of boots, which I think you have in your sideboard and not your main board, yeah, Lightning Greaves is over here in Swiftfoot Boots. If you can slap boots on this thing, I already like it a lot more, but uh, it's really, really close. I think it's worth thinking about for a second because it does represent a lot of advantage, but it is a pretty wide hoop to jump through. I will say for what it's worth, if you can put a +1/+1 counter on this creature, which you have a lot of ways to do so, and if you can then just use your other proliferations, the Skywarden does become quite a big threat by itself while having a pretty good ability. But one of the things is like I'm really picky on cards that are like 6 mana or more that have an attack or a damage trigger. This card is 3 mana, so I'm a lot more forgiving. But the funny part is the other reason I'm forgiving about it is that I think to myself, who's gonna destroy this card? Like outside of a board wipe, who's using their targeted removal on this card? This card isn't very good. So it's not really worth it for them to be using their targeted removal on this card, which allows it to fly under the radar. Haha, funny pun. Now, I don't think that's a great suggestion because if the idea is this card is kind of bad, so your opponents will let you do what you want with it, is not a great suggestion, but it's something worth talking about and thinking about. So I wanted to include it here. One more card to do with transforming that I think is kind of missing is Norn's Inquisitor. Norn's Inquisitor incubates 2 when it enters the battlefield, and then whenever your permanents transform, you put another counter on it. So this is once again not a fantastic card, but this is like a big, you know, token uh a big incubator kind of synergy in draft in the main set. And the fact that it's just kind of slowly grows your incubation tokens a little bit and produces its own token, I think this is close. I think this is much better than some of the one drops that I was a little more critical on. That we can use it to instead, replace Crawling Chorus or Bilious Skull Dweller really, really easily. It is double the mana, but I think it just does a better thing. If Brimaz is out, this creates 2 incubator tokens, which I think is worthwhile to consider. So All in all, I think this is a pretty decent card, and I think definitely one to consider. Then when it comes down to what else to proliferate, something else that we were thinking of, I have two suggestions here. One okay, one better. The okay one is Norn's Wellspring. I really do like the synergy here. The fact that it works on your creatures dying, it gives you a scry every time they die, which I think is already very, very good. I think that's fantastic because you're already wanting your creatures to die, and getting a little advantage there from it is very strong. But then for 1 mana, you can remove 2 oil counters, and you get an oil counter everything something dies, and you can draw a card. I think 1 mana to draw a card is definitely playable. I think because it works really well with your proliferate strategy with Brimaz, you're going to be able to trigger this repeatedly. I think all in all, this is just going to be a very strong card that you can just kind of put it onto the side. It costs the same as flipping an incubator token, which is pretty low. And while you have this on the field each turn, it costs just 1 to keep up to draw a card from it. I think you're going to have a lot of success with it. I will say that I am suspicious of it because I find it really hard to actually, until you play with it, you won't know for sure exactly how much advantage it gives you. But I do think it is rather, rather strong. Also, this art and this text is so metal, I can't imagine not playing it. Then when it comes to mana, we have Black Market here. And Black Market says whenever a creature dies, put a charge counter on Black Market, and then your pre combat main phase, you gain that much black mana. I think this is exactly the kind of card your deck wants. It's not at 4 mana, so it's already great. It works with proliferation, which is really, really good, and it gives you mana. Now, this mana can be spent just on your spells as regular, or you can just put this mana towards flipping your incubation tokens, right? Because it kind of creates a cycle. You flip your incubators, you attack with them, they die, you put more counters on black market, and at end of turn you proliferate and you put another counter on black market. This it is a bit tricky because though it doesn't really say it, you have to wait an entire turn for this effect to actually do anything. But if you can play this and immediately trigger it by doing an attack with Phyrexians or sacrificing a Phyrexian right away, you will get at least the 2 counters back, and if not more. And with that, as you go like each turn cycle, this will produce more and more mana. And if you think about that, every 2 counters is another Phyrexian flipped or incubator flipped. It's a really good way of looking at it, and you'll get that advantage or you'll get that mana back incredibly fast. In addition, if you actually do spend this mana on more powerful cards in your hand, I think you will also just be very, very, very happy with the results. And honestly, this card only being $3 is a little surprising to me. I remember when this used to be a lot more, so it is quite a budget inclusion if you ask me. So very, very nice. I think that I would play that for sure. Now, looking for anything else to note. I think if you really wanted to go a little further into sacrificing our artifacts, there aren't many, but you can go into Scryfall and look at cards that sacrifice in our colors. Let's see, white, black, sacrifice, artifact. And there's going to be a few options here. Annihilating Glare comes to mind because that's removal. Looking quickly for anything else. Chronomancer, I think, would probably be your best bet. And everything else, I think you're generally, that's good. I think you're already generally playing, or might just be a little too much. That could be close. Sorry, I'm just looking through real quickly as we're coming to the end of the video, just in case I've missed anything pretty big. Okay, so those will be the main suggestions I'll have Chronomancer is one of those 40k cards, so whether or not you want to play it will be up to you. They're a bit contentious, but I think this one is rather strong, where it's 1 mana, sacrifice another artifact, draw a card. This allows you to constantly, just like Norn's Decree, was it? Norn's Wellspring, sorry. You pay 1 mana, sacrifice an artifact, draw a card, and 1 mana to draw a card is a great rate. It is also an artifact creature, so it will trigger Brimaz, which is nice. And then finally, if you're sacrificing your incubation tokens, that will count as a Phyrexian dying. So this is just another way to ensure that you will get your triggers, your proliferation triggers, to grow your board. So that is a really good one. And then Kesket, I don't like as much, but it's worth considering. Kesket sacrifices 3 creatures and/or artifacts, and you look at the top 3 cards, put 2 in your hand and 1 in your graveyard. I don't really like Kesket because Kesket always feels like it's a lot of work to get almost no advantage. Like, you do draw 3 cards, but you usually are behind quite a bit to do so. But in a deck that is very good at creating tokens and token artifacts, I think this is a good direction to go into. Furthermore, if you want to go further in this direction, the next thing I would suggest is looking at ways for the deck, especially in black, to create treasure tokens, because not only will that help your mana, it will also be the artifact that you can sacrifice for other means, much like your incubation tokens. So those are the 2 things that I would suggest to look into. Otherwise, I do really like this deck. I think it's very strong. I think this is a very good Brimaz deck. Looking at it makes me actually want to play Brimaz, which the first time I looked at him, I couldn't quite wrap my head around him. And then I looked at the other option for white black, which I believe, there we go. Let's see, which was Moria and Teshar, which also felt really, really weird. So I think even though, white black, they're my colors, I kind of decided to pass on this one. But looking at Brimaz, I can see how it works a lot better. I can see how it functions here as a Phyrexian tribal deck. So I do really like it. I am interested to see another draft of this because I think this deck can be really fun. I notice you have a bunch of tutors and stuff on the side. If you do submit them, we'll have a conversation on power level. If you do resubmit, I should say, we'll have a conversation on power level in the future so that we feel that, we can suss out exactly what power this deck wants to be at and to find a way to put it to that power level. Whenever you do want to send me the next draft of this deck, or whenever anyone wants to send me any draft of any deck, there is a form in the video description below that you can fill out to do so. And if you would like Kybor, want to support the channel and bring your video or your deck assist video to the next one on the list, please, there is a link in there that you can click if you're interested to do so. Finally, if you like to do the whole YouTube thing, like, comment, subscribe, do all of that jazz, I think that would be very helpful for the channel and I would be very appreciative. All right, this video has gone on long enough, so good luck on this deck.